What's going on, everyone? Welcome back. Today we have got our Week 13 waiver wire pickups. It's crunch time right now on the cusp of the fantasy playoffs. So make sure to tune in. Hit that like button, subscribe if you guys enjoy, and check us out online at adpfantasy.com. Join the free newsletter, become a member, get personalized fantasy advice to go ahead, get you that success in the playoffs and in your championships. All the details in the description, but for now, let's get right into it. We kick things off at the quarterback position, and at the risk of beating a dead horse, we have got Sam Darnold here yet again. His ownership is not high enough, simply put, and this will probably be your last chance to go ahead and potentially stash him because the slew of good matchups continues, and in Week 13, it doesn't get any better than this, folks. The Cincinnati Bengals, last week versus the Raiders, 315 yards, 2 touchdowns through the air, and also a rushing touchdown. Look, I get it. Season-long basis, you probably don't want to invest in the Jets offensively, but these next couple of weeks, it might go ahead and actually pay off, specifically in fantasy as well. A lot of opportunities here for this offense, and Sam Darnold highlights the list of Jets players you want to look into. Next, we've got Mitchell Trubisky. And look, Trubisky is still one of the worst quarterbacks in the NFL, but you know that saying, even a blind squirrel finds a nut once in a while? Well, the Detroit Lions are that nut for Mitchell Trubisky, and that is his opponent Thanksgiving Day for Week 13. Last week versus the New York Giants, 278 yards passing, 1 touchdown, 2 interceptions, but he also did have a rushing touchdown to somewhat salvage his day. And it seems like it's only versus teams like the Bucs, the Redskins, and the Lions that Trubisky has some success against. And lucky enough for him, he plays the Lions twice a year, this being the second time. Now, the Lions defense, not all that great. They gave up a win versus the Redskins last week. So I do think Trubisky, all things considered, even though it might only be for a 1-week rental, could have a potentially decent performance versus Detroit between 15 and 20 points. Next, we have got Ryan Fitzpatrick. Now, this last week, 2 touchdowns, 2 interceptions, but also did have a rushing touchdown. So somewhat mediocre, but these next couple of weeks, similar to a situation like Sam Darnold, the Miami Dolphins face the Philadelphia Eagles, their Week 13 opponent, who can be beat via the secondary. But then the New York Jets, the New York Giants, and the Cincinnati Bengals. As crazy as it sounds, I'm suggesting stashing Ryan Fitzpatrick, a member of the Miami Dolphins, heading into your fantasy playoffs. I do think he could pay off. And kind of spoiler alert, he's not the only Miami Dolphin that I have on this list. I like this Miami offense moving forward these next couple of weeks, and Fitzpatrick, again, will be the key. Our final quarterback is Kyle Allen of the Panthers, who against all odds last week versus the Saints, 256 yards passing and 3 touchdowns. Now, maybe Allen is flying a little bit under the radar, which I do think he should be because he does have a lot of issues, and specifically turnovers, because with him, when it rains, it pours. And also on top of this, if you look at his stats on a week-to-week basis since he started, 2 weeks in a row, he hasn't really had good fantasy production. So you might be a little bit worried in this Week 13, considering what he did versus the Saints last week. But the opponent is the Washington Redskins, and I do think Kyle Allen will have some opportunities. So if you're willing to take a chance, this is a favorable matchup and one that could potentially be exposed by the Panthers offense. Getting to our running backs next, we start with Rashaad Penny, the hot name for Week 13, and that's because last week he had 14 carries for 129 yards and 1 touchdown. Now, a lot of that yardage and the touchdown did come on his big, about 50, 60-yard touchdown run, so do keep that in mind. But this is somewhat of a worst-case scenario for all those Chris Carson owners because Carson fumbled yet again, and Penny saw an uptick in his carries. He's now healthy, which means all of a sudden we could see him be a part of this potent Seattle offense. And if you're someone that's desperate at the running back position, well, Penny's definitely got the upside, but also do keep in mind he does have a low floor. The matchup versus the Minnesota Vikings for Week 13 is also less than ideal. So again, temper the expectations, more so a stash, especially if you are a Chris Carson. Continuing on, we've got Darrel Williams and LeSean McCoy of the Kansas City Chiefs. And their availability is somewhat high at this point in time, specifically Darrel Williams, because the Chiefs are coming off the bye week and they face a great opponent defensively in the Oakland Raiders. Now, obviously, a lot of this is predicated on the health of one Damian Williams and whether he will suit up in Week 13. If he does, then both these guys will be devalued in terms of their fantasy production. But if not, well, LeSean McCoy, a great PPR option, even though we do have to see how he progresses from his so-called concussion. And if both those guys are unavailable, McCoy and Damian Williams, well, then Darrel Williams could be a fringe RB1 in fantasy for Week 13. Our third and final running back is Benny Snell of the Pittsburgh Steelers. And again, this is predicated on injuries. James Conner didn't play last week. Right now, tentatively, the expectation is he won't suit up in Week 13. And Jalen Samuels kind of fell out of favor this last week for the Steelers. But one thing that hasn't changed is the Steelers do want to rush the football. And Snell got 21 carries this last week. A matchup versus the Cleveland Browns without Myles Garrett should be somewhat favorable. And if that usage continues, Benny Snell, not a bad option, low-end RB2. Moving on to our wide receivers, we start with Robby Anderson, who this last week had 4 receptions for 86 yards and a touchdown. And out of the two big-name Jets pass catchers in Jamison Crowder and Robby Anderson, Anderson is probably the one that is more available, and I'd say go ahead and pick him up. Other than the great matchup versus the Cincinnati Bengals in Week 13, we have seen Robby Anderson kind of turn it on late in the year after maybe a somewhat more disappointing majority of the season. It kind of happened last season, and with the favorable matchups these next couple of weeks, I wouldn't be surprised if it happened in the 2019 season as well. Next, we've got Russell Gage of the Falcons. And quick note, this is more so of a PPR edition because Gage fills that kind of Mohamed Sanu slot role for the Falcons. But the reason we're more so high on him this week is because the potential injury to Julio Jones, that shoulder. We don't know what his status will be. He has to have a quick turnaround as the Falcons play the Saints on Thursday. And Gage did see more opportunities this last week. 8 catches for 76 yards. So that's why we highlighted the PPR aspect of this. And I will say, I don't anticipate the Saints not really putting up a lot of points like they did last time the Falcons played. I think there's going to be a lot of points being put up here. So the Falcons will have to air it out a bunch. And regardless, whether Julio Jones plays or not, I do think Gage will have some opportunities here. Our third and final wide receiver is Cole Beasley of the Bills. This last week, 6 receptions, 76 yards, and a touchdown. And now he gets to face his former team in the Dallas Cowboys revenge game. We'll see how much of that narrative holds and whether he's going to have a bigger role in that game. I don't think that'll necessarily be true. But what I do like for Cole Beasley is, again, his availability somewhat high. And in PPR formats, he does get a lot of targets. He's more of that slot wide receiver. And the Dallas Cowboys did give up a pretty decent game to Julian Edelman this last week in the rain, considering the conditions. So Beasley might not be a bad PPR play again for Week 13. Getting to our tight ends, we start with Mike Gesicki of the Dolphins. And like I told you guys before, I actually like some of these offensive weapons, specifically in fantasy, that the Dolphins have moving forward. Versus the Philadelphia Eagles, okay, maybe not all that ideal, but then the Jets, Giants, and the Cincinnati Bengals, we know how those teams fare against the tight ends, specifically the Bengals. This last week, Gesicki had 3 receptions, 28 yards, but the ever so important touchdown for the Dolphins. So Gesicki might not be a bad stash going into your fantasy playoffs if you need help at the tight end position. Next, we have got Ryan Griffin, and at the risk of sounding like a broken record, at the risk of beating a dead horse, you need to own Ryan Griffin. He's actually a decent option at the tight end position if he's still available. And his availability isn't all that high at this point in time, which I am bewildered by. He was producing before the Chris Herndon fiasco of him going on IR, and afterwards as well. Last week, another touchdown, and now in Week 13, he gets the Cincinnati Bengals. That should be all you need to know. Griffin's a decent player who has an established role on this offense for the Jets. They've got favorable matchups. Go ahead, pick him up if he's there. Our third and final tight end is David Njoku of the Browns, and he's off the IR. Didn't quite get on the field in week 12, but maybe it's week 13 that'll be the magical week for him. Kind of tough matchup versus the Pittsburgh Steelers, even though the Browns did wax them the last time they played. However, with David Njoku, considering all the hype that he had leading into the season, why not go ahead and take a chance on him? I realize, there aren't a lot of stats right now for him to go ahead and base some future production on, but if you've got the roster space and you potentially want to hit a home run pick at the tight end position and you can afford to be patient, go ahead, take a chance on Njoku, see what happens. Finally, getting to our defenses, we start with the Philadelphia Eagles. They've got a great matchup versus the Miami Dolphins in Week 13. Now, I do think that the Miami Dolphins will score a little bit more points here than some people might expect, but still, the ceiling for this Philadelphia defense is very high. They've also got a very favorable playoff fantasy schedule. They held their own versus the extremely effective Seattle Seahawks offense last week. So you got to like their chances versus the Miami Dolphins. Go ahead, check on the Eagles if they're available because they're a viable start not only this week but moving forward. Next up, we've got the Carolina Panthers, and even though this is a defense that's given up a bunch of points these last few weeks, they faced the Washington Redskins in Week 13, and the thing here is the Redskins, compared to the other offenses they have played, don't have the high offensive output potential really as much as the previous opponents. And with rookie Dwayne Haskins riding this high coming off a win, I think he could crash back down to earth real fast. The Redskins kind of struggling on the offensive line. If the Panthers can stop the run, which is obviously a tall task considering they've struggled in that department, they can go ahead and cause several turnovers for Haskins. Either way, I think they're going to get several sacks here on the rookie quarterback and at least 1 or 2 interceptions. So I love the Panthers defense in Week 13. Our final defense of the week is the Cleveland Browns as they face the Pittsburgh Steelers. This is going to be a pretty stingy and nasty game considering what happened a couple of weeks ago. But the reason I like the Browns, obviously they're without Myles Garrett, which doesn't help them, is because the Steelers have yet another quarterback change. This time it's going from Mason Rudolph to now Devlin Hodges. Point being is I don't think either of these guys, whether it's Rudolph, whether it's Hodges, is really all that good at the quarterback position. Hodges has been confirmed to start versus Cleveland, and even though he did have that nice touchdown pass to James Washington last week, other than that, the Steelers kind of really struggled all game long. So I like the Browns and potentially what they could do versus another inexperienced quarterback. So with that, we wrap things up, and as always, let me hear it in the comment section. Did you agree, disagree with these names? Are there other guys that you would include? Let me hear them along with any other questions you guys might have. And as always, if you enjoyed, hit that like button, subscribe. Check us out online at adpfantasy.com. Join the free newsletter, become a member, get personalized fantasy advice. All the details in the description. But for now, I'll see you guys in future videos.